Okay, so let me switch to English because the presentation will be in English now. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Valentina Bianchi, who studied at Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa, the twin institution of the local École Normale. And she's now professor at the University of Siena. Giuliano Bocci, who studied at the University of Siena, and then he had positions around Europe, in Geneva in particular, and he's now professor at the University of Siena. And Silvio Cruschina, who also studied in Siena in part at the beginning, and then he was in Vienna for several years, and now he's a professor of Romance linguistics, I guess, at the University of Helsinki. Okay, so there are three specialists of three slightly different domains with something in common, which is a strong background in syntax. And then Valentina looks at the interface with meanings, formal semantics, and Giuliano at the interface with sound, particularly prosodic phonology, and Silvio is the full-fledged syntactician of the group, and they will use their respective perspectives to analyze WH constructions that we've been talking about several times in this course, and that clearly require an integrated analysis of these, involving all these different levels. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and the floor is to you.
So thank you, Luigi, for this introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure for us to be here in this institution and to have received this invitation. So in this talk, we present the result and the findings of our work as a team, as a research team, the work on prosody of WH questions in Italian, which stems from a series of collaborations and joint papers starting from 2021 to current research. As Luigi already mentioned, and as the title suggests, so the empirical domain is WH questions, and we use prosody, and in particular the prosodic pattern that characterizes Italian WH questions, to discuss and to deal with issues at the so-called crossroads, so the interfaces between syntax and prosody on the one hand, and between syntax and semantics on the other. So the central idea of our work is that in order to account for some specific facts, empirical facts about prosody, the prosody of Italian WH questions, and that's what we are presenting today, we must assume that syntax acts as a driving and intermediary force between the interfaces, so providing instructions to the prosodic component, to the phonological component on the one hand, and to the interpretative semantic component on the other. So this is the outline of today's talk. So we will start with an introduction to the problems and questions addressed in the talk. We will then provide an overview of the prosodic patterns that are available cross-linguistically to mark WH questions, and then we will concentrate on the pattern that characterizes Italian WH questions. And then in section 3 and 4, we will discuss experimental evidence that confirms the strength, the robustness, and consistency of the pattern that we described for Italian, and that shows that this pattern is sensitive to syntax, in particularly to the syntax of WH questions, so to how the questions are syntactically derived. And we'll present first evidence from a production experiment in section 3, and then evidence from a comprehension experiment in section 4. Section 5 is about the analysis we want to propose, or we have proposed, and then in section 6 we talk about variation. So there is, of course, prosodic variation with respect to the main prosodic pattern that emerges in our experiments, and this variation depends on the type of WH phrase. So we will also explore some possible explanations to account for this variation, and then we will conclude with some concluding remarks. So let's start with the introduction. So in Italian, English, and many other languages, there is usually a direct correlation between prosody and the focus of a sentence, in the sense that the main prosodic prominence that we can describe in terms of nuclear pitch accent, so the strongest nuclear pitch accent within the sentence that is not followed by other pitch accents, this NPA signals the new information of the focus in a sentence. Now, when the NPA is in the rightmost position, which is the default position in these languages, there is, to some degree, some ambiguity with respect to the size of the constituent that counts as focus that contains the word that is marked with the nuclear pitch accent, which is indicated in boldface in the examples in 1. So this is the so-called focus projection. So usually WH questions are used to elicit focus, as in 1. So with the question in 1a, what did John buy? And then I reply, he bought a car. I'm eliciting a focus on the argument, a car, which is in boldface in the example. And this receives the nuclear pitch accent, so the strongest pitch accent of the sentence. Then with the question in 1b, what did John do? I'm eliciting a predicate focus. He bought a car. So the new part, the focus of the sentence is between brackets, is the predicate bought a car. And then in 1c, what's new? I'm eliciting all new information. So the whole sentence is in focus. It's all new information. But as you can see, I hope it's the right bottom. Yes, here. So car is the word that is always marked with a nuclear pitch accent. So within the focus, in brackets, this word is always inside, but the size of the focus can be different. By contrast, when the NPA, when the nuclear pitch accent is not in the rightmost position, only the argument containing the word marked with the nuclear pitch accent qualifies as focus. So the answer in 2, he bought a car for her, can only be a felicitous, a possible answer to the question, what did John buy for Mary? And then I reply, he bought a car for Mary, and car bears the nuclear pitch accent. It cannot be a good answer to the questions in 2b and 2c, as indicated by the hashtag, which stands for pragmatic oddity or impossibility. Okay? So there is this correspondence, this association between the nuclear pitch accent and the focus in the declarative sentences, in the answers we saw here. What about the WH questions themselves? So let's start to ask this question, first of all, from a semantic point of view. WH questions have something in common with declarative sentences containing a focus, and that's the association with sets of alternatives. So according to the traditional semantic analysis, a question denotes a set of possible answers. So at the same time, as in the examples we saw before, in the answer, the focus also evokes a set of alternative propositions, which must correspond to the possible answers. And this is known as the question-answer congruence. So let's consider one example. So a context with 3 individuals, Paul, David, and Fred, and 2 restaurants, Bella Italia and Da Michele. So if you have a question, which restaurants does Paul like? The meaning of this question is the set of possible answers. Paul likes Da Michele, Paul likes Bella Italia. When I answer this question with 3a, Paul likes Da Michele, I'm choosing one alternative, but at the same time, in this declarative sentence, I'm also creating a set of potential possible alternatives. Paul likes Da Michele as opposed to Paul likes Bella Italia. So it's also important to notice there must be this correspondence between the WH phrase and the question and the focus in the answer. So if I shift the NPA, so what signals the focus, to the subject, Paul likes Da Michele, as in 3b, this is not a felicitous answer. Same in 4. In this case, we have the same set of alternatives, but the WH question is on the subject. Who likes Da Michele? So it's Paul likes Da Michele, David likes Da Michele, Fred likes Da Michele. That's what the question means. And then in the answer, I need to have the focus on the subject. So also on the subject that corresponds to the WH phrase element who. So Paul likes Da Michele. I cannot answer with Paul likes Da Michele. That would be also infelicitous. So this is the question-answer congruence, according to which focus in the answer evokes a set of alternative propositions that must correspond to possible answers. So from a semantic point of view, WH questions and sentences with a narrow focus share this set of alternatives. And this tight connection between the WH phrase and the question and the focus in the answer that I just described in terms of congruence requirement, and the fact that both introduce a set of alternative propositions has led to the hypothesis that WH phrases are inherently focused. So we know what the focus in declarative sentences, because this is signaled by the nuclear pitch accent. So to the question, what is the focus of the WH question, we can reply, at least semantically, that's the WH phrase. This is an hypothesis, at least. There is one view about this correlation, according to Reinhardt and following work. So the prosodic marking of focus, the NPA, and the semantic interpretation are directly associated. So there is a direct association between the nuclear pitch accent and the focus. But then there is an alternative view that has been developed within the cartographic framework, starting with the work by Rizzi in 1997, according to which there is a focus feature in the syntactic structure that is mapped to the prosodic mapping, so with the interface with phonology, and to the semantic interpretation, the interface with the interpretive component. So if we have our example, Paul likes da Michele, and da Michele is the focus, in the syntactic component, the fact that it's a focus is marked with a syntactic feature, and then this feature is read off at the interfaces providing specific instructions, like assign the NPA to this word, da Michele, to the phonological component. And then as for the semantic interpretive component, the instruction would be generate a set of alternatives, so assign the semantic of a focus. Okay. So we will argue in favor of the second hypothesis. And but to do so, we need to argue against the other one. So the idea that there is a direct association between prosody and semantics. What do we need to do that? So this direct association hypothesis can be falsified by empirical evidence of structures showing a systematic mismatch, a systematic disconnection between prosody, so the nuclear pitch accent, and the focus interpretation, that is the generation of alternatives. And this is exactly what happens in the question. So we have this association in systematic connection association in the answers, so in declarative sentence with a focus, but we don't have it. We have instead a dissociation in the WH question itself. Why? Because as Ladd observed, although the WH phrase should qualify as the focus in the question from a semantic point of view, there is cross-linguistic variation as to where the nuclear pitch accent is realized. So in many languages, the WH phrase is not marked by the nuclear pitch accent. So, and this leads me to the next point, which is the prosodic patterns of WH questions, first cross-linguistically and then for Italian. So, if we have a question like in 5, this is English, where are you going? So the nuclear pitch accent indicated in bold is on the first syllable of the verb going. 5b would be probably possible, but not as an out-of-the-blue sentence question. So there are, at the same time, other languages with WH movement, so with the WH phrase at the beginning of the sentence, where the nuclear pitch accent is assigned to the WH words itself. So this would be Romanian, as illustrated in the example in 6. So the nuclear pitch accent is always on the WH phrase at the beginning of the sentence. So we can already observe 2 patterns. So in the first one, WH questions are marked as statements, as declarative clauses, so that the default assignment of the NPA is on the stressed syllable of the rightmost constituent, as in English. Remember, where are you going to the end? And in this case, it is as if the WH element did not bear focus, at least not prosodically. At the same time, there is another pattern in which WH questions are treated differently from declarative clauses. The NPA is indeed assigned to the WH word, as in Romanian, Hungarian, and Greek. In this case, it is as if the WH element did bear focus. Now, the question is, what about Italian? So does Italian represent a third pattern? So the first observation about this, the pattern of Italian, is by Ladd, according to which, unlike Romanian, in Italian the WH, the nuclear pitch accent goes at the end. Dove l'hai comprato? Where did you buy it? But then Marotta clarifies that this is not just the verb, but it must be, this is not just the last constituent, it must be the verb. As you can see in 8, a chi daranno un aumento. This is the default way to pronounce a WH question in Italian, to whom they will give a pay rise. So the nuclear pitch accent is on the verb daranno. So this is true of bare WH questions with the bare WH elements like chi, che cosa, dove, quando, come. So who, what, where, when, how. And so the NPA is always assigned to the verb. So it would be really a third part. And we saw NPA on the WH question at the beginning, NPA at the end of the sentence, and Italian is systematically assigned to the verb. And this is a marked position because Italian, as I said earlier, in Italian the NPA is by default assigned to the rightmost element. Now, from a semantic point of view, we can observe that even if we have the NPA on the verb, the NPA does not correlate with the focus interpretation, with focus semantics, because we don't have a set of alternatives generated on the verb, but the possible answers are the form of they will give a pay rise to X. So the set of alternatives is always generated with respect to the WH phrase. And also, we do not generate a set of alternatives that differs in the verb position, contrary to what happens in declarative sentences. So if I have the NPA on a verb in a declarative sentences, then I do have a set of alternatives, like in 9, non ho chiesto un aumento, l'ho preteso. So I didn't ask for pay rise, I demanded it. So if I stress non ho chiesto un aumento, I'm creating an alternative, and the alternative is pronounced explicitly like I demanded it. So in this case, we have a systematic dissociation between the NPA, the position of the nuclear pitch accent, and the focus of the question. So it's also important to note that the NPA is always on the lexical verb, so an auxiliary like anno, a chi hanno dato un premio, would be impossible to pronounce with the NPA on anno, to whom did they give the award. Cannot say a chi hanno dato un premio, I have to say a chi hanno dato un premio, so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is how it should be pronounced. And also when we have complex WH questions, so with two verbs, so if we have a main clauses, a matrix clause, and then an embedded clause, we have the question, okay, now we have two verbs here, to which one is the NPA assigned to, and it could be also the embedded one. It doesn't have to be the one close to the WH phrase. So in 11, this question would be pronounced as che cosa gli hai detto che ha fatto, Carlo? So with the NPA on fatto, so on the embedded verb. It doesn't have to be the main verb. So our proposal against the direct association hypothesis, we propose that the position of NPA is driven by a syntactic focus feature, and then the dissociation between prosody and semantic interpretation can be explained in terms of the general mechanisms that build the syntactic structure. And as I said, to defend this hypothesis, we provide evidence from two experiments, a production experiment and a comprehension experiment. And I will start with the production experiment. So this was a reading task. And we used stimuli sentences like the one in 11 and 12 that were characterized by two conditions. So we used bi-clausal WH questions where they had a matrix clause and an embedded clause. We called the verb of the main clause V1, just descriptive terms, and then the verb of the embedded clause V2. So we have two conditions. One is short distance movement, which means that the WH is an argument of V1, so chi pensa che ti dovrei presentare al direttore, who thinks that I should introduce you to the director. So in this one, in 11, chi is the subject of the verb pensare. In 12, Chi comes from a long distance, so that's why a long distance movement, because it's the direct object of V2, the verb presentare. Okay, remember the question we want to answer is to which one is the NPA assigned to, because we have two verbs. Remember the short and long distance conditions. We analyzed almost 500 target sentences produced by 10 speakers. So these are the results. You can see that we have V1 here, short movement, and then V1 and V2 here, long movement. But we can see that in both conditions, the NPA is never, it's 0%, assigned to the rightmost element, which is the default position in Italian for the NPA in declarative sentences at least. It's almost virtually never assigned to the WH itself, so we have very low percentages that can be considered to be negligible or marginal. And then with short distance movement, the NPA is almost always assigned to V1. So this is the plot here. So the main verb. With long distance movement, the NPA is predominantly assigned to V2. So the embedded verb, this is 62.7% of the case. But there is also a secondary pattern, so in which it is assigned to, the NPA is assigned to the first verb, to the matrix verb. We have examples. I don't know if the audio has been tested and it works.
Chi pensa ti dovrei presentare al direttore?
So this is a short movement and you can hear that the nuclear pitch accent is on V1. Chi pensa che ti dovrei presentare al direttore? And then we have long movement.
Chi pensi che dovrei presentare al direttore?
In this case, the nuclear pitch accent is on V2. Chi pensi che dovrei presentare al direttore? So this is the predominant pattern with long movement, but we also have the secondary pattern here, different sentence. Who did you say will call Giorgio? This is long movement and the NPA is on V1.
Chi hai detto che telefonerà a Giorgio?
Chi hai detto che telefonerà a Giorgio? So this is the secondary pattern with long distance movement. Okay, so the NPA, this is the summarize the results of the production experiments. The NPA is systematically assigned to the lexical verb, and only if the WH element is extracted from an embedded clause can the NPA be assigned to V1. So there is the sensitivity to the syntax, syntactic derivation. So the NPA is sensitive to the derivational history of the WH phrase, that is to the base generalized position from where the WH has been extracted. So the next question we wanted to address was the psychological reality of this observation. And for this, we wanted to test how prominence distribution play a role in comprehension. And Giuliano is going to talk about the comprehension experiments.
Okay, before introducing the comprehension experiment, let's look a sec to this fictional dialogue between two speakers, say speaker A and speaker B, okay? So speaker A starts by saying something, a huge fight is about to explode in our condo. I've said to the building manager that the Rossis sent a warning letter to Carla, okay? Consider this a long sentence. And to this statement, speaker B replies with a question. So, sorry, I didn't get it. A chi hai detto che hanno mandato una di fila? Okay? To whom did you say that they sent a warning letter? Now, the question here is ambiguous, okay? This is different from what we have seen in the production experiment. Here, the sentence is completely ambiguous because it has two possible interpretations, a long construal and a short construal, okay? So with a short construal, we have something, to whom did you say that? That's basically the meaning, right? And with a long construal, we have something like, to whom did they send the warning letter? Okay. Of course, the underlying structure is different, because if we have a short construal, the WH element is first inserted in the structure as a complement of the matrix clause, while in case of the long distance movement structure, the WH element is starts as a complement of the embedded clause, as indicated in purple. Okay. Now, given the generalizations we got from the production experiment, we can formulate at this point two clear predictions. Okay, so our predictions are the following: the prosody in which the question is pronounced could differentiate between the two potential interpretations. And more specifically, if the nuclear pitch accent is realized on V2, we should expect that the hearer interprets the question as a long-distance WH movement, okay? And that would be the only possible interpretation for the question. On the other hand, if the nuclear pitch accent is assigned on V1, the verb in the matrix clause, we expect two possible interpretations. One with short distance movement, and the other one with long distance WH movement. Let me quickly play, if I'm able, the two possible pronunciations.
Chi hai detto che hanno mandato una diffida?
Nuclear pitch accent on detto, the matrix verb.
Chi hai detto che hanno mandato una diffida?
Mandato bears the nuclear pitch accent, okay, the verb in the embedded clause. Now, okay, even if the prediction let's say, are clear, but how could we tell which interpretation is assigned, okay, by the hearer of these questions? Well, one possibility is to look at the way speaker A answers the question addressed to him, okay? So we can imagine that if speaker A answers something like to the building manager, well, we can conclude, presumably, that the question was interpreted as a short distance WH question. On the other hand, if the answer is something like to Carla, then the interpretation assigned was the one of long distance WH question, okay? So with this kind of dialogues, we tested 40 participants in comprehension, all of them native speakers of Italian. We manipulated the prosody of the WH questions with two possible conditions. So the nuclear pitch accent assigned on V1 and the nuclear pitch accent assigned to V2, okay? What about the task? Well, participants had to listen to the dialogues, okay? And then they were asked to take the role of speaker A and type an answer on a text field according to the context, okay? Then we collected the responses and they were coded as congruent with respect to a short or a long distance interpretation of the question. Let me show you the results here. You can see in this plot the probability of having a long distance interpretation of the question over the short distance interpretation as a function of the distribution of the nuclear pitch accent assigned on V1 or V2, okay? Let's start with this column. No, it doesn't work. Here we have the condition in which a nuclear pitch accent is assigned on V2. As you can see, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the interpretation assigned was the one of long distance WH movement. On the contrary, if we move at the other condition, nuclear pitch accent on V1, we observe that both interpretations become possible, and actually they basically do not differ from chance, okay? So basically both possibilities, both interpretations are available. So in other words, the predictions are confirmed. Nuclear pitch accent on V2 forces a long-distance interpretation of the question, while nuclear pitch accent on V1 is compatible with both a short and a long interpretation, okay? Now, let me quickly recap the results that we have discussed so far. So Italian displays a very peculiar prosodic pattern in WH questions. The nuclear pitch accent is always assigned to a lexical verb. That's the first point. The second one is that when we have a short distance question, The nuclear pitch accent is always assigned to a verb in the matrix clause. However, in case of long-distance WH movement, we have some sort of optionality because the interpretation could be, the nuclear pitch accent could be assigned either to V1 or V2. Okay, so we have a case of partial optionality. Furthermore, the findings from the comprehension experiment show that the nuclear pitch accent association is a clue exploited in comprehension by the hearer to parse the syntactic structure. Okay. Now, let me let me sketch the analysis we want to propose. Okay, the analysis we propose is based on the successive cyclic nature of syntactic movement. A syntactic constituent can be moved very far away from the position in which it is originally inserted within the sentence. So let's consider a case like 16a. Who did Mary think John saw? Okay. Who is first inserted in the structure as a complement in the embedded clause, and then is surfaces in the left periphery of the matrix clause. Okay. Now, a large body of evidence has shown that WH movement does not move from its initial and final position in one single step. Okay, so the representation we see in 16b is simply wrong. That's not what happens. On the other hand, on the contrary, movement is composed by a series of more local steps. The presence in the structure of certain syntactic domains forces movement to break down into small pieces of movement. Okay, you can see here that, no, you cannot see. We have the WH element that cyclically moves in short steps. Here it's 16c. These domains are known as phases. The complementizer phrase and the verbal phrase qualifies for movement of this type as phases. Okay? Now, besides this general property of movement in human languages, we have two specific syntactic assumptions. The first one is that an interrogative WH element bears a bundle of features, a WH feature and a focus features. The second assumption is that a WH phrase may optionally share WH and focus features via agreement with the head of every phase it passes through. Agreement is obligatory in the final ending site of WH movement, but here we are assuming that agreement can also license the focus feature in the intermediate position of the movement. Okay? So imagine a long-distance WH question like 3b. A chi ti ha detto che hanno rubato una macchina? Okay. From whom did you tell me that they stole the car? A chi is extracted from the embedded clause, and it must reach the left periphery by moving cyclically. You see the purple arrows. Now, passing by the phases indicated here with little tp, cp, and so forth, an agreement relation can be optionally established in these positions. And via this agreement mechanism, the element hosted in the head of this projection can be licensed a focus feature. So this means that, at the end of the syntactic computation, we may have a certain number of elements endowed with the focus feature, okay, with this mechanism. And all of them are potentially eligible for nuclear pitch accent assignment. However, at the syntax prosody interface, we postulate the presence of a set of rules and filters that eliminate certain configuration, making possible only certain specific patterns, filtering out other possibilities. Now, as for the syntax prosody interface, we adopt the model proposed, the morphophonological model proposed by Calabrese, and under this approach, the grammar includes both positive instructions, rule, and also negative statement, filters. Filters check that a structure is well-formed. If the structure is not well-formed, is ruled out, okay? Moreover, we assume that in Italian there is a special class defined in phonological term of elements. Certain functional elements are prosodically dependent. What do I mean? Well, I mean that functional elements of this class cannot be associated with the nuclear pitch accent unless they are the only elements produced, like in isolation, okay? So this class of prosodically dependent elements include different types of elements. Bare WH elements, but also, for instance, hell expressions in certain WH phrases. Valentina will go back to this point later on. Also, complementizer are prosodically dependent, okay? As for the syntax prosody interface, we have three specific assumptions. The first one is that if the structure contains an occurrence of a focus feature, then the nuclear pitch access must be assigned to the syntactic element that bears this feature. And crucially, the prosodic computation does not differentiate between criteria or interpretable instances of this feature and just purely formal instances of the feature. We assume also two. A nuclear pitch accent can be assigned, must be assigned to the rightmost phonological element which is pronounced, which is endowed with the focus feature. This is needed because in our structures we may have several instances of the focus feature, and we must decide which one takes the nuclear pitch accent. It's going to be the last one, provided that it's actually pronounced and not just null or deleted. And we also assume three. Prosodically dependent elements cannot bear the nuclear pitch accent unless they appear in fragments, okay? Notice that 3 is a negative statement, is a PF filter. When a prosodically dependent element is pitch accented by the previous assumptions, then 3 acts like a PF filter, ruling out the structure which are ill-formed, okay? Let's consider first the main point to explain. Why don't we observe the nuclear pitch accent assigned on the WH element? Okay, here we have a chi ti hanno dato un premio, to whom did they give an award? In all the cases, these type of questions are produced with a nuclear pitch accent on the verb. We can imagine that a chi leaves establish agreement with dato. Dato is licensed with a focus feature, and then the end of the syntactic computation, dato is the rightmost element endowed with a focus feature, and it gets the nuclear pitch accent. Okay? Now, we could imagine that in a derivation like 10b, the optional agreement is not established in the little VP phase, okay? So in this case, the point would be that the only element endowed in the derivation with the focus feature is a key, the WH element itself. But this configuration is ruled out by the filter because a key is a weak element. Now let's consider the prevailing pattern in case of long-distance WH movement. A chi ti hanno detto che hanno rubato la macchina? From whom did you tell me that they stole the car? Okay, here the WH is extracted from the embedded clause, and we can imagine, given our assumption, that the WH phrase establishes agreement passing by the different phases. And the end of the syntactic computation, the rightmost element, which is pronounced and endowed with the focus feature, is rubato. As such, it receives the nuclear pitch accent. We have to explain also the secondary pattern observed in case of long-distance WH movement, right? Given our assumption, we can assume that in derivation 3b double prime, agreement is not established, since it's optional, in the embedded clause. And the WH phrase establishes agreement only in the first phase in the matrix clause. And in this case, detto, the lexical verb in the matrix clause, is the rightmost element which is pronounced and endowed with a focus feature. For these reasons, it gets the nuclear pitch accent, and since detto is a lexical verb, the PF filter is not triggered. Okay. Finally, we want simply quickly mention that there is an impossible pattern. So short distance WH movement, but the question is long. In 3a, now a key is a complement on the matrix verb, right? So in the syntactic derivation, there is no way in which a key moves across the phases in the embedded clause. That's the reason why we cannot observe in short distance WH movement that the nuclear pitch accent goes on the lexical verb in the embedded clause, because the WH element never passed through this kind of structure, okay? Now, this is basically the mechanism we propose to account for the prosodic patterns observed in case of bare WH elements. Now I leave the floor to Valentina to consider a more articulated picture.
Okay, so on the basis of this PF filter, we argue that certain purely functional elements are prosodically dependent and they cannot bear the nuclear pitch accent. Now, by purely functional element, we mean an element that lacks descriptive content. And to illustrate what we mean by descriptive content, consider the question in Italian, 20 in Italian, che cavolo hai comprato al mercato? Literally, what cabbage did you buy at the market? Now, this allows for two interpretations in Italian. The first one is, what type of cabbage did you buy at the market? And so here, the noun cavolo, cabbage, clearly has descriptive content, right? So it describes the type of vegetable. But this also allows another interpretation, which is essentially, what the heck did you buy at the market? And here, clearly, the noun cavolo doesn't have descriptive content, but it simply marks, essentially, an interpretation that we characterize as radical non-discourse linking. So we say just, what the hell, I have no idea what you bought at the market. So essentially, the alternative answers cannot be linked to a contextually salient set of entities. So in the first case, we have descriptive content. In the second case, homophonous, but the noun cavolo is just a functional element that doesn't contribute to descriptive content. So now our approach predicts that in this second interpretation corresponds to a functional element that cannot bear the nuclear pitch accent. And in fact, Bocci 2013 pointed out that when cavolo, when this noun bears a nuclear pitch accent, then it cannot have the second interpretation. So when we have a question like che cavolo hai comprato al mercato, so literally, what cabbage did you buy at the market, with prominence, nuclear pitch accent on the verb, then both interpretations are possible. So cavolo could be either have or not have descriptive content. But if we put the nuclear pitch accent on the noun, che cavolo hai comprato al mercato, then only the first interpretation is available, where the noun contributes descriptive content. So this is a very, very nice, let's say, example that really shows, let's say, that even the same, phonological content has a placement of a nuclear pitch accent that really depends, essentially, on the nature of the element, of a WH element. So then, the hypothesis that the descriptive content in a WH phrase is linked, let's say, or attracts the possible assignment of a nuclear pitch accent was investigated in a production experiment by Bocci, Cruschina, and Rizzi, 21, that we'll just go through quickly. So this experiment involves the testing 3 types of WH questions in neutral contexts that were compatible with all the 3. So the first one was a why question, like perché hai lavato il divano? Why did you wash the couch? This is an experimental condition that we won't discuss today for reasons of time. Then we have a partitive WH question, like chi di voi ha lavato il divano? Who among you wash the couch? Where clearly the WH phrase chi di voi, who among you, has a descriptive term, right? So we are referring to you, a set of people. And the third one is with a WH the hell question. So chi diavolo ha lavato il divano? Literally, who devil wash the couch? It simply means who the hell wash the couch? I have no idea. So these was again a reading task involving 8 native speakers of a Tuscan variety of Italian, and the results was analysis of around 346 sentences. And these are the results. For reasons of time, we, let's say, leave aside the rightmost column concerning the why question, and we concentrate on the first 2. Let me see if I can, yeah, okay. So as you can see, there is a sharp difference between the 2 conditions. So when we have a WH the hell interpretation, so where there is no real lexical descriptive term, as you can see in the almost 95% of cases, the prominence actually goes on the lexical verb. Whereas in the case where of a partitive WH phrase, where there is descriptive content, in almost 85% of cases, the nuclear pitch accent goes on the WH phrase itself. Chi di voi ha lavato il divano? Who among you wash the couch? There still is around 15% of cases where the nuclear pitch accent goes on the lexical verb. So in other terms, these WH the hell, non-delinked WH phrases virtually never bear the nuclear pitch accent, whereas partitive phrases predominantly but not exclusively bear the nuclear pitch accent. So here in the WH the hell condition, as you can see, the prominence with the falling nuclear pitch accent goes on the verb lavato, whereas in the case of a partitive,
chi di voi ha lavato il divano?
Chi di voi ha lavato il divano? With prominence, as you can see, the falling nuclear pitch accent is on chi di voi. Okay, so the data, let's say, from this experiment show that the nature of a WH phrase is also relevant in determining nuclear pitch accent assignment. So we saw before that the derivation, right, long distance, short distance movement is relevant, but now also the nature of a WH phrase counts. So when there is a descriptive term, there is a possibility to assign the nuclear pitch accent to the WH phrase. So the most natural hypothesis here to account for this variation is to assume that the presence of a descriptive term in the WH phrase is a necessary condition. So this is the condition that is not satisfied in the case of purely functional elements like bare WH phrases without a descriptive term, or even WH the hell phrases. By contrast, when the WH phrase includes a descriptive term, the nuclear pitch accent can but need not be assigned to it. So, in case there is a descriptive term, then we have an optionality. Nuclear pitch accent can go on the WH phrase or on the lexical verb. Now, the further question that we have just started exploring is whether the optionality observed in the second case is sensitive to any semantic and pragmatic factors. So this is, let's say, the further development that we just started exploring now, and I'm going just to give you, let's say, some preliminary discussion. So we refer to, let's say, an idea that Luigi presented in a paper back in 2003 concerning the interpretation of, let's say, the syntactic position and the interpretation of the descriptive term of a WH phrase precisely at the interface between the syntactic component and the interpretive systems. So his proposal is that when you have a descriptive term that refers to some, let's say, set of entities that is already salient in the context, already introduced or salient somehow in the context, In a case like 22, for instance, quali di questi libri hai letto? Which of these books have you read? These books is clearly a contextually salient set. And then his proposal is that this descriptive term essentially has a topical status in the sense that Luigi discussed before. In fact, in Italian, you can even see a structure in which this descriptive term is overtly topicalized. So you can have something like di questi libri quali hai letto? Among these books, which one did you read? And in this case, the idea is that the descriptive term is interpreted in the periphery of a sentence. On the other hand, when we have a simple question like quali libri hai letto, which books did you read, and there is no salient set of books, let's say, in the content, no contextually salient set of books, then the descriptive term is not discourse linked, and then it is reconstructed, which means that at the interface with the interpretive component, it is essentially interpreted in the original position, as you can see here. Is marked, let's say, by this. So in the case of a delinking, the restricted term is interpreted in the left periphery as a topic. When there is no discourse linking, the restrictive term is interpreted within the predicative nucleus that corresponds to the tense phrase, the projection of a tense head. Now, a conjecture that we just started exploring is that, in fact, when a WH phrase bears the nuclear pitch accent, when the descriptive term is discourse linked, and therefore it is interpreted in the periphery of a clause, and it is not reconstructed in the initial position, in the position where it is initially merged. In order to check this conjecture, then, of course, we have to find for cases of questions that are not ambiguous, let's say, between two interpretations, right? So we may assume that in cases like who washed the couch, there may be a salient set of individuals in the context, or there may not be. Okay, so we want to find cases in which there is no ambiguity. Now, one interesting case is the case of a presentational their construction in English. So in English, you have a contrast between a question like how many books do you think there are on the table, which is fully acceptable, and how many of the books do you think there are on the table, which is deviant, is a weird question. Now, the difference, as you can see, is that in the first case, how many books, books doesn't really have any, let's say, reference to a contextually salient set. And so, by hypothesis, it is reconstructed, as we said, in the initial position within the predicative nucleus. Whereas in how many of the books is a salient set, so it's licensed as a topic in the left periphery, and it's not reconstructed within the tense phrase, so there is no reconstruction here. So now the conjecture which we proposed is that we expect that the nuclear pitch accent in Italian can be assigned to the WH phrase when we have essentially, cannot be assigned to the WH phrase in this kind of construction. So why? Because in this construction, necessarily the descriptive term is interpreted within the predicative nucleus. So we have a prediction here based on this grammaticality, the contrast that has nothing to do with intonation, but we have a prediction that in this particular configuration, the nuclear pitch accent cannot go on the WH phrase. Now, we must say that there are differences between the presentational construction of English and the presentational structure of Italian. But for our purposes, actually, let's say it works. We can be tested. Sorry, something weird happened. Okay, so our conjecture then predicts that the nuclear pitch accent cannot go on the WH phrase. We don't have experimental evidence yet on this, but in our judgments, this is in fact the case. So we can ask quali libri ci sono sul tavolo, which books are there on the table with prominence on the verb be, but quali libri ci sono sul tavolo is markedly deviant. So in this case, the nuclear pitch accent cannot really go on the descriptive term, even though it is pronounced in the high position, in the peripheral position, but it is interpreted, as you can see here, in the low position. And so if it is not interpreted in the high position, it cannot bear the nuclear pitch accent. So this is a case in which we can force essentially a non-discourse linked interpretation. And now we're looking also for another context in which instead we force a discourse linked interpretation. And this is, of course, just to final remark here, of course, if you have a simple predicational structure, not a presentational structure, as in 28, quali libri sono sul tavolo, which books are on the table, this is not presentational, it's a simple predicative structure, and in this case it is possible to, let's say, to place the nuclear pitch accent, to realize it on the descriptive term. Then we looked for, let's say, the reverse case in which the WH phrase necessarily has a discourse-linked topic-like interpretation. This comes from a structure that is available in the colloquial register in Italian, in which it is possible to have a WH phrase with a descriptive term that is associated to a clitic pronoun, in the same way as Luigi showed before for left dislocated topics. So at the colloquial level, you can say things like, quale libro l'hai letto in una serata? Which books, literally, which book did you read it in one evening? Where, as you can see here, we have this low pronoun, this clitic pronoun here, it, which is associated to the WH phrase quale libro. Now, we can take the presence of a clitic then to be an explicit indication that the descriptive term here has a topical status, and so it is interpreted in the left periphery and not within the sentence nucleus. There are also empirical arguments that support this view, but for reasons of time, we cannot present them now. We can come back to this if you want in the discussion, session. So now our prediction is that in this case, the nuclear pitch accent necessarily goes on the WH element, and this in fact is the case. So we say quale libro l'hai letto in una serata? Which book have you read it in one evening? But if we try to put the nuclear pitch accent on the verb, the result is very deviant. Quale libro l'hai letto in una serata? Which book have you read it? With prominence on the verb is completely unacceptable. And of course, here we can make a minimal comparison if we just take away the pronoun, so the element that marks that the WH phrase has a topical status, has a topical descriptive term, then taking away the pronoun, it is perfectly possible to put the nuclear pitch accent on the verb. Quale libro hai letto in una serata? With prominence on letto. So these two data, even though not yet experimentally tested, suggest that the conjecture might be on the right track, right? So in other terms, the assignment of a nuclear pitch accent has as a necessary condition a descriptive term within the WH phrase for assignment of the nuclear pitch accent to the WH phrase, but then the sufficient condition is that this descriptive term has a topical status, so it is discourse linked. Now, in the very few couple of minutes, we would just like to propose a particular, let's say, novel view of characterizing this notion of delinking, which has been characterized in different ways in the literature, so we would like to propose, let's say, a new perspective that is related to the notion of situation anchoring. Now, just as a very, very brief, let's say, intuitive introduction, it's very clear that natural language sentences essentially are about a specific situation that we define as a target situation, leaving aside certain generic sentences, but a famous example is the one by Perti 1973. Imagine that two people, A and B, are in their car, and after driving into the highway, one says to the other, "I didn't turn off the stove." Now here clearly this sentence is about a particular target situation. Let's say the situation in which they were about to leave home and they forgot to turn off the stove. So a sentence is typically about a target situation. However, it has been observed that some sentences cannot be coherently interpreted relative to a single situation. So imagine a situation in which there was a prison breakout, and then after a long chase, a police officer declares, after a long chase, some fugitives are now in jail. Now, as you can see here, it is impossible to interpret the whole sentence relative to a single situation, because we are saying that there are some people who were fugitives in a particular situation, call it S2, label it S2, and these individuals are now in prison in a target situation S1, so they are no longer fugitives, clearly, because they are back in prison, right? So this shows that the subject, some fugitives, is interpreted by anchoring it to a situation called a resource situation, which is distinct from the target situation. I hope the point is clear. It's rather subtle, but now the very interesting fact is that this interpretive possibility depends on the syntactic structure. And here we come back again to the presentation of their structure. So if you compare the sentence in 32, some fugitives are now in jail, with the presentational structure like there are now some fugitives in jail, ci sono ora alcuni evasi in prigione, you can see that 32 was not incoherent, but 33 is. In 33 we are saying of a target situation that there are some people who are fugitives in the target situation and at the same time are in prison in the target situation. The sentence is incoherent. We cannot have this independent anchoring of fugitives to a different, distinct situation. So the conclusion is that the presentation of their structure, the subject can only be anchored to the target situation. Now, in my joint work with Cristiano Chesi, essentially we proposed that the anchoring of interpretation depends on whether an element is within or outside the predicative nucleus, namely the tense phrase. So we propose that all the material that is within the predicative nucleus is anchored to the target situation. It is part of a description of a target situation, whereas the peripheral material, which is outside the tense phrase, is anchored independently. And notice that, let's say, the independent, the so-called resource situation can be related to a target situation in different ways. So one can precede the other, as in the fugitives example, or the resource situation can be larger and the target situation is a part of it. So there are various possibilities, but we're talking about two distinct situations. Now, remember that by hypothesis following Rizzi 2003, in the presentation of their structure, the descriptive term of the WH phrase is reconstructed within the predicative nucleus. And then we can get, let's say, to a possible characterization of a notion of discourse linking in terms of situation anchoring. When in the presentation of their structure, the descriptive term of the WH phrase is reconstructed within the predicative nucleus, and so it can only be anchored to the target situation. So, in other terms, when you have a question like quali libri ci sono sul tavolo, which books are there on the table, we are reconstructing the descriptive term here within the predicative nucleus, and so it is anchored to the target situation, which is describing something that is on the table in the target situation. So we are only concerned with a set of books that are on the table in the target situation. This book might well be empty, but we are only concerned with that. Whereas when you have a sentence with a question with prominence on the descriptive term, quali libri sono sul tavolo, which books are on the table, here essentially what happens is that we are presupposing the existence of a set of books in a larger resource situation, and then we are asking which ones in these set of books that are in the larger resource situation are on the table in the target situation. So in other terms, the question in 29 essentially presupposes a set of books, some of which are on the table and others are not, within a resource situation that is salient, whereas there is no such presupposition in 28. right? We have no presupposition about which works precisely we are talking about. Yeah, okay, so it's not very easy, let's say, to give an intuitive idea of this distinction, but the distinction, let's say, is rather sharp. And so we believe that this might be a way to characterize the notion of discourse linking, because it creates, let's say, an interesting connection with these peculiarities, like different peculiarities of a presentational their structure, of a presentational structure. Okay, so at this point we can conclude. So we have shown that Italian WH questions showcase a clear dissociation between the position of a nuclear pitch accent and the focus interpretation, in particular in questions with the bare WH element, and this clearly goes against the direct association hypothesis. On the other hand, the position of a nuclear pitch accent is exploited in interpretation, as we saw in the comprehension experiment, but it is used to disambiguate essentially the syntactic structure and the underlying syntactic structure. So there is no direct association, but still it's not the case that a nuclear pitch accent is irrelevant to interpretation. So this is really very, very special, let's say, type of a situation. This is why this phenomenon attracted our attention in the first place. So we propose that the nuclear pitch accent is assigned to a lexical verb as a result of a local syntactic relation of agreement between the focus marked WH phrase and the verb in the intermediate steps of the movement derivation. And because of this mechanism, the verb is assigned a focus feature which is there just because of an agreement relation, so it's not interpreted in that position by evoking focus alternatives, it's just a byproduct of a movement of a WH phrase as tracked by, as we saw, a long distance versus short distance movement. We have proposed that a necessary condition for a WH phrase to bear the nuclear pitch accent is that it contains a descriptive term, so this excludes the purely functional WH elements, and we speculated for a moment that the descriptive term can be interpreted in a peripheral topic position or be reconstructed into the predicative nucleus following Rizzi 2003, as, let's say, a way to characterize a sufficient condition for nuclear pitch accent assignment, namely, the nuclear pitch accent is assigned to the WH phrase if and only if its descriptive term is discourse linked. So that's a possibility that we're going to test experimentally in our future work. And thank you for your attention.